Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break and another chance to catch up with colleagues across the whole volunteering sector. And we're going to start our afternoon session with a video from the Minister for the Department for Communities, and that is Deirdre Hargey, MLA. So what will happen now, my screen will switch to Deirdre, so we'll do that now with the help of Bev in the background. And thank you to the Minister. It's great to have the work acknowledged at that level within government. So thank you to Deirdre Hargey, MLA, for contributing to our event today. Now, our next guest is Tiger D'Souza. He is the People Engagement Director for the National Trust. And within his role, he has a responsibility for inclusion and strategic volunteer development. This is within the Trust. And in 2020, he was awarded in the New Year's Honours List an MBE for his services to volunteering during the pandemic. Congratulations on that, Tiger. And you're going to talk to us about how you see volunteering changing within the National Trust in the next 3 years. Vital times, vital times. So I'll hand over to you, Tiger. I will come off screen and give the whole show over to your good self. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much, Tiger.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to share my screen and my PowerPoint slides. So hopefully they come up for you. Can someone just let me know that you can see them before I carry on?
I can see them, yes.
Brilliant stuff, good stuff, thank you. So it's great to be with you today. It's wonderful to join you. And I think, in many ways, the pandemic, and this image for me kind of like sums it up really, in many ways, the pandemic just emphasized the importance of volunteering, the wonder of volunteering, and the impact that volunteering can have, from people, helping out with the vaccination program, to the kind of things that Deirdre was talking about in her introduction about, supporting local communities and people stepping up. And for me, it pushed volunteering probably more so into that camp of, helping out, just trying to do my bit, do my part, play my part, and that localized element is so important. And I think that as our organisation looks forward, there are huge things that we can benefit from in relation to the pandemic, but also some watch outs for us. So I hope you had a chance to watch the video that I shared ahead of today with some content in relation to our research. If not, don't worry, you can watch the video after the event, and I will be sharing a summary report which will help. But before I get going, I want to shine a spotlight on the here and now. And I think what's important to remember, that although we are being future focused at the National Trust and we're thinking forward to how do we embrace the changes that are facing volunteering and the challenges maybe that we might have to look into, but also the opportunities we may be able to benefit from, that's only going to take up in the next 3 years 20 or 30% of our time. And our real focus, especially this year, is on our existing volunteers, on returning our existing volunteers, on checking in with them, on seeing if they still want to continue to support our organisation and enabling them to return in an environment, obviously with the latest outbreak in the pandemic, that remains uncertain. Now, we've got so many people that have given us so much time over their lives that have made such a positive contribution, that it's really important that we think about what have we done in relation to communication, in relation to engagement, and most importantly, in relation to change management. So a lot of our organisations have been forced and compelled to change as a result of the pandemic, and it's really critically important that we engage our volunteers and involve our volunteers in those changes so they feel a part of our organisation and are recognised as the key stakeholders that they really are. So before we talk about the future, I just wanted to reflect on the present and the importance of working with the volunteers you currently have, supporting them to return, and ensuring that their voices feel heard and valued in the changes that you will inevitably need to do in the next coming months and years. So the report, the research report that we did this in 2018, and the purpose of it was about taking a future focused lens. Let's think forward to 2030 and try to understand what trends are going to be impacting on society, between now and then, and how they would impact on volunteering. And for us, it was volunteering participation and inclusion. And I'm not going to run through all of these today, but the two that I'm really going to draw out and pull out that have accelerated through the pandemic is citizenship and automation. So in terms of citizenship, we saw lots of local mutual aid groups either spring up or expand the work that they were doing locally. We've seen a desire for people wanting to help out neighbours. I mean, I certainly know that I've got a better knowledge and understanding of my neighbours than I had pre-pandemic. And that sense of very hyper-local community, desire to help out within there, is really incredibly important. And for an organisation like us at the National Trust, we need to think through that actually we have a blend of two things. We have a national brand and identity, but we also have local properties and places that have an important role and play an important role within their communities. So given that growth of citizenship, how do we think through both the attraction, recruitment, support and development of future volunteers that responds to a desire to do good and to do good locally? And the second element and aspect for me to pull out today is automation. So if we think about some of the ways in which we've used technology over the last 18 months to 2 years, it's been fundamentally different. And people have an increasing demand and will have an increasing demand and expectation for that kind of technology. So how do we create an environment whereby volunteers might be able to give us their time in a piecemeal way and be able to identify and find opportunities, maybe at the last minute, drop into those, access them, get a connection with us, get the induction or the support that they need in order to be able to perform that role, and the feedback on the impact they delivered through that role. So I've seen this been an incredible growth in terms of volunteering apps and systems that we can use, and we need to be thinking about how do we ensure we stay as up to date and as up to speed as we can do with wider technology, because people's expectations will go with what they use on a day-to-day basis, and irrespective of budgets, there will be an expectation that we provide that same degree of service and that same level of access and opportunity. I've got a few diagrams that I'm going to run through. This one comes from a piece of research done by NCVO, which was a decade ago, Pathways Through Participation. And within this, they talked about different ways in which people want to get involved and want to engage with organisations. And I think what we have seen through the pandemic is a growth of a desire to do piecemeal irregular activity, for people to segment their lives into pockets and bundles of time, and to be able to allocate and distribute that time as they would choose. Traditional volunteering models that we have deployed in the past have been much more on the consistent deep or consistent light variety, where we have a regular ongoing expectation or a regular ongoing desire for people to connect with us. At the National Trust, that might be in terms of room guiding or gardening or providing rangering activity in support of looking after our countryside. But generally speaking, there is a regular, ongoing, consistent commitment being given, either at a highly intense or a lesser intensity. And we know and we see, both through the trends of the research that we've conducted, but also in terms of the patterns that we are seeing in terms of how people want to live their lives now, post-pandemic, when so many of them have had frustrations around, seeing relatives or their ability to travel, that new priorities are coming up. So our ability to respond with volunteering that can be broken into and pulled into these lives is really, really important. So what changes are we making as an organisation? And I'm going to talk you through these three key critical components of our volunteering model. So the first is positive, and in part, there is a risk that organisations might feel it's been, things have been maybe slightly easier whilst volunteers haven't been in the organisation, or that they may not necessarily have historically a positive bent around volunteers and volunteering. And I think it's really important that we challenge those negative narratives, and we encourage people to see the benefits, the positivity that volunteering brings. So there's something around celebrating the power of volunteering. There's another thing which leads into that point I made in the previous slide, which was around flexibility and being able to create a more malleable offer with a variety of different ways in which people can connect and engage with us and donate their time to support our cause. And then finally, inclusivity. So there's been a raft of research that's demonstrated, particularly recently, that volunteering isn't necessarily as inclusive as we'd like it to be. That there are challenges that we have in relation to the diversity of the people who choose to volunteer, or how those people might want to engage with us as organisations, around our ability to make the adjustments necessary, for example, to enable people, disabled people, to be able to volunteer with us. So there's lots of different activities we need to do to make volunteering more inclusive, and in doing so, we'll be able to attract and appeal to a wider demographic of volunteers. And that will be even more important if we continue to see an erosion of those consistent types of roles of volunteering and a growth of more flexible, piecemeal, irregular type activities. So this is a slide for me just to represent what we think about in relation to positivity and positive volunteering. And there is something for us around being really clear about our principles moving forward, reviewing our volunteer agreement, our volunteer charters, so that we are clear around the type of relationship we're having, and that we really do see that mutual benefit for both the volunteer as well as the organisation. We are looking at how we might campaign both internally and externally to maybe change the perception of what volunteering is for the National Trust, and also the types of volunteers that we engage within the National Trust. But the most important thing is that volunteers make such an enormous contribution to us as an organisation that it's critical that we think through how do we celebrate that contribution, how do we help demonstrate the impact that those individuals are making, and how do we create an environment that feels positive and celebrates and recognises the valuable contribution that volunteers continue to make. So positivity is a key one of our pillars. The second of our pillars around flexibility. So time well spent, the NCVO report from 2019 came up with eight areas that they said that compromised and helped to make a quality volunteering experience. And of those, one of those, a critical one of those, was flexibility. And especially if we are looking to engage with people in a post-pandemic world, we recognise that before the pandemic, we already had challenges around the sandwich generation, with people that would be normally likely to volunteer facing challenges both in terms of providing childcare and support to grandchildren, as well as providing care to elderly parents. And that we live in a world with a greater degree and a greater variety of choice. And with that choice, people are being more discerning about how they spend their time. So being able to bend the volunteering opportunities that we have and flex those around people's lives will be increasingly important as we emerge from the pandemic. And this slide captures some key points that came up from both our futures research, but also the time well spent report. And I'm anticipating that those figures around dip in, dip out activities or one-off activities and events are going to go up, and they're going to continue to go up, because people have had a taste of volunteering through the pandemic, whether it's been through supporting a local food bank or helping out a local charity or organisation, or being a vaccine volunteer, being able to do volunteering on their terms. So how do we adjust what we offer, how we schedule and structure what we offer, to enable that degree of flexibility that people have grown to experience, including first-time volunteers, over the past 18 months to 2 years. This is a quote. So NTVO did a follow-up to the time well spent report, and they looked specifically at diversity and inclusion within that, and the diversity of volunteers and their volunteering. And this is a quote from Priya Singh, who's the chair of NCVO, from the foreword to that report. And it is very clear that there are some challenges that we have in relation to the diversity of those people who volunteer with us. And in part, it's not surprising. So many people volunteer, and part of volunteering for them is their social circle. They come to volunteer and they benefit from volunteering, from engaging and meeting with other people. And in doing so, they then go out and then invite other people to come and join them in volunteering. And what you end up then through that is groups of friends or extended groups of friends coming together in service of your organisation as a collective of volunteers who have a lot in common, share a lot in common, and have a great affinity with each other. And there's nothing wrong with that. The challenge happens when we then look at, are we providing as equally positive experience for others? So in the National Trust, are we providing as positive an experience for younger volunteers? Do we have and are we attracting a sufficient diversity of volunteers from either an ethno-cultural background or disabled volunteers? Are we making the adjustments that we need in order to bring those people in and working hard to make sure that they are blended within the existing mix of volunteers that we currently have? This is not about transitioning a new wave of volunteers for an old wave, but it's about how do we bring both of those together to form a really strong volunteering workforce that will help us as an organisation deliver our objectives and our ambitions moving into the future. My slide just stuck. Oh, there we go. Right. So in summary, just to wrap up, and I wanted to leave sufficient time for us to have some questions and answers. But the world has changed, but yet it remains very familiar. The types of volunteering roles that we offer as an organisation remain predominantly biased towards those structured, regular, ongoing volunteering opportunities. How do we innovate? How do we move beyond that? And how do we respond to some of the challenges we're seeing in society that as an organisation and a charity we have a duty to try to tackle? So as an example, climate action is rising up the agenda. In thinking about the types of volunteering roles we create to help us respond and take positive action in relation to the climate, can we think differently about the blend of the opportunities that we develop? Can we think not only about those consistent, regular opportunities, but also those that fit a more flexible and agile world? How do we think about the behavioural shifts, and how do we look at the trends that we are seeing in society and make adjustments not only to the types of roles we offer, but our practice and our behaviours within our organisation and the volunteering culture and climate that we create? How do we bring different groups of people together in a way that enables them to build meaningful and strong relationships rather than feeling either in conflict or not necessarily gaining the social benefits that they were seeking to receive from their volunteering activity? So we need to think consciously and mindfully about how we build stronger, more diverse, inclusive volunteering workforces that responds to the shifts and the trends that we are seeing. And finally, I would say and encourage all of you to identify what your key priorities are. We have identified ours, and they're very simply that volunteers are the lifeblood of our charity and of the charity sector. Without our volunteers, we would not be able to do what we do. And therefore, we need to create a positive environment for our volunteers, both for our existing ones to feel valued and recognised for their contribution, but also to enable us to attract new people to come and volunteer with us. We need to think more flexibly. Volunteers will increasingly want opportunities that will fit with their day-to-day lives, and their lives are changing. In the new normal, in a post-pandemic world, people will have prioritised and reprioritised things that they've missed out on as a result of the pandemic. So how do we adjust our approach to volunteering to enable them to blend that with their new priorities in the new world? And finally, how do we create a much more inclusive volunteering environment so we can reach, excite and engage a much more diverse pool of people, whilst at the same time maintaining, caring for and continuing to support our existing volunteers? So I will stop at that point and open to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Tiger, thank you so much for that. Your work on the way forward for volunteering in the National Trust is really inspiring for others in a very wide range of organisations, small or large, the way that you're working with volunteers. So there are a few questions coming in on the back of that. So let's start with this idea. What practical steps is the Trust taking to make volunteering more flexible? Those practical things on the ground?
Yeah, so I think it starts with your opportunities. The first thing is about what type of opportunity are we offering? So if traditionally, for example, you had a volunteering role that was, once a week, you did a 4-hour shift once a week, you could shift that to say, well, actually, we only need you to come and do once a fortnight or once a month. So if people want to continue to do once a week, that's fine. But if someone says, actually, I can only give you once a month, than being able to do that. And I saw that when I was at NSPCC with Childline, is we would lose Childline counsellors after a year's service. And part of the reason was we expected 40 shifts over the course of the year. But you reduce the number of shifts, you hold on to the expertise, you reduce the requirement, and then people are more willing and able to continue with you. And then the second is when you're designing new volunteering opportunities, think about, does someone need to physically be on site to do this? Are there things that we could ask people that they could do in their homes that would still be volunteering, but would help us to achieve our ambitions and our aims? And there are a number of products that we've got in the pipeline that we're looking to develop to hopefully give people the ability to volunteer in their own homes and not necessarily need to come to our sites.
So a couple of practical ideas there. And just staying with this, whilst we all agree more flexible, positive and inclusive opportunities are ideal, and this theme has come up quite a lot today, hasn't it, about inclusivity. It's having the resources needed to adequately support a new volunteering infrastructure is a challenge, to say the least. So, how could they achieve this?
Yeah, I think it depends on, all organisations are different and have different levels of resource at their disposal. But, there are many small organisations who have volunteers who play a much more active role in the coordination of volunteering, or the structuring of volunteering, or the delivery of volunteering, or the development of volunteering, than perhaps we've historically been open and willing to do so. And I think that if we broaden our minds around what volunteers can contribute and how they can contribute, we don't limit ourselves to think we have to come up with a task, and then we have to allocate that task, and then we have to manage the volunteer to do that task. And we start to broaden our minds to actually, we have a problem, and we recognise that we could do with some help in fixing that problem. And we go out and say, can you help us fix that problem? And we give ownership and accountability to those individuals who come forward within a framework that enables them to help us to deliver against what we're looking for. So I would say, be more open and willing to giving greater degrees of responsibility and accountability to volunteers, and they will surprise and delight you.
Yeah, that's a lovely outcome, isn't it? That really is. And there's another question. A few people are asking this. The piecemeal opportunities might work for volunteers, but how do you make that work for organisations? Again, small and large, are the principles the same?
Yeah, so we've got an experienced design team in my department, which sounds very, very swanky, but effectively the mindset behind it is starting with your end user. So you start user first. We start with it might be the volunteer, it might be a member, it might be a visitor. It's all about their experience, and work back from that. And historically, what we've done is we've started with the organisation. We've gone, the organisation needs X, Y, and Z, and this is how we'll corral people into giving us that. And if we look at the way that participation, the ways people want to participate is evolving, we think about books such as New Power, which was out only a few years ago, but continues to shape people's thinking. The world has changed and evolved. And if you want to excite, and you want to engage, and you want to mobilise people to support you, start with thinking about them first, and then work backwards. And actually, the technology exists, and it's not necessarily that expensive, but the technology exists that will enable you to then work from that point. And too often, I think we paralyze ourselves by saying something, by presuming something will be too hard, or presuming something will be too difficult. And I encourage my team to think and start with, what is the art of the possible?
You mentioned technology there. There's a question down the list a little bit, but it says, what technological solutions is the Trust looking at to solve some of those issues?
So I've got a big piece of work to do in the new year. So we are looking at our systems from a people perspective completely. So we're having a complete look at our people systems and our infrastructure, and having an exploration within the marketplace about what's available, but also what do we need today and what will help us support us tomorrow. I mean, the whole reason I did the futures research, and we did it to 2030, was that we are a very large organisation. If we invest in a bit of technology or we implement a new system, it takes us a long time to get it in place, a long time to establish. And if we are working on today's trends, by the time we've got it operational, the world's moved on. So I would say, think give yourself, think 10 years into the future, what's going to be happening in 10 years? How do you want to operate and manage 10 years into the future? And then develop your technology on that basis rather than what you feel that you need to do.
And another issue that's come up in the questions there, it's about, selling volunteering impact is often difficult for organizations. Now, I don't know if that's the same for the trust, but, how does the trust achieve this, amongst everything else that you do, selling that volunteering impact?
I think the key thing is about looking at what your charitable objectives are, so what you're trying to achieve as a charity, and then figuring out, well, how can we deliver against that, and then identifying the role that volunteers can play within it. I mean, I'll take a non-trust example. When I was at NSPCC, there was a service that we provided for children who had been abused, and it was about helping them to recover from the abuse they had. And we put volunteers into that service to just effectively act as a support person for the child. Now, we could have put a caseworker in there. We could have put a paid member of staff in there to deliver that and had greater control over it. But actually, the young people valued the volunteers' role because here was an adult playing a positive aspect and role in their life that wasn't being paid to do so, that was doing it voluntarily. And that you can't buy that kind of contribution. So I think it's about identifying that sometimes volunteers help you achieve stuff because of the many hands methodology. You've got more pairs of hands, you can get more done. Sometimes volunteering impact comes from the fact that what they bring, because they're coming in a voluntary capacity, is something that money can't buy and you can't put a price on. But yeah, there are toolkits. I would recommend having a look at NCVO, and the Volunteer Impact Assessment Toolkit is one way of thinking about measuring volunteering impact.
Could you put that link up onto the site when we're done here? Just another couple of minutes, if that's all right, Tiger, that would be lovely.
No problem.
Because here's a question. What are the ingredients of a positive environment for volunteers?
I think there's something about feeling valued. I think there is and within feeling valued, there's something about having a voice. And for a lot of people, they mistake volunteers having a voice as I've got to do what the volunteers say. And actually, quite often, people who are able to share their opinion, even if you don't then take action on it, feel valued still because you've at least listened to what they've had to contribute. So there is that element. There is something around their support and development. And then there are the basic hygiene factors around creating an environment where people feel able to be their authentic self and bring their authentic self to when they volunteer. So those, for me, I feel are really important factors that can help create a positive environment.
Lovely. Well, first of all, thank you to the people who put forward the questions. It just developed some of the things that you were talking about, Tiger, and it was lovely to hear about how you are looking for a way forward of volunteering within the trust, and anybody listening, whatever size of organization, can draw ideas and inspiration from what you've presented this afternoon. So thank you very, very much for that, Tiger. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Lovely stuff. Now, we're at 2 o'clock, almost at 2 o'clock. We're back on time again, which is lovely. And we're going to have a panel of guests now. And each of them will have 10 minutes to set out how there's some lovely reaction coming in there to Tiger's contribution this afternoon. Lots of lovely handshakes and things. So anyway, we'll each have 10 minutes to set out how they see future volunteer involvement developing based on their experience. So there'll be a lot of ideas here. Some you may know of, but some may be new to you. And our first speaker is Catherine Muldoon. She in Breastfall and will outline how they moved not only the festival online, but also volunteering opportunities online. So I shall hand over to you now, Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne, and thank you to everyone who has involved us here today. I'm going to be talking about the digital volunteering side and the impact of moving online on our event and our volunteers. So quick introduction to Breastfall for those who may not be aware of us. Breastfall started as two breastfeeding brothers bringing other breastfeeding mothers together outside Belfast City Hall. This grew into an award-winning festival, which has now grown into a high-impact, innovative organisation that has stuck to its core of celebrating, supporting and normalising breastfeeding. Volunteering have been core to Breastfall from day dot. From the very beginning, Breastfall has been volunteer-led and run. It was only in April 2021 that, thanks to the work done by our board and the Community Innovators Fund, that I was able to come on as the first Breastfall employee. But volunteers are the heart and soul of Breastfall. There are those who have attended in the very first year of Breastfall that went on to volunteer, the second and the third year, and are now Breastfall board members. The original Breastfall was a one-day in-person event, which moved from the Mac in Belfast to the Ulster Museum, and that was all due to the exponential growth of the numbers of attendees. But then 2020 hit with COVID, and we made the decision to go online because we couldn't meet in person, but also we knew that there wasn't just a want for Breastfall to continue, but a need. Being a breastfeeding parent can be isolating at the best of times, but those restrictions and the fear that was out there, and it was a scary time for a lot of parents. So we moved from this one day in-person event to an all-week online conference. And we felt that it was better to stagger this over a week so that it made it more accessible. So rather than parents and supporters having to sit in front of a camera, in front of a screen all day, they were able to choose and pick which events that they wanted to go to. And we had a huge audience when we moved online. And that was because we had that engaged number of people that were at home, wanted to be with other people, were either on furlough or on maternity or on paternity, and at home wanting to be with other people. And we had that focused attention. And because of this, we needed really well-trained and well-supported volunteers. So that meant that we were creating training events in the run-up to Breastfall, and we had to really maintain a really high quality level of communication with our volunteers. So that was across WhatsApp and emails in the run-up. But then on the week of the event, we had to have emails every single morning that highlighted what was going to happen that day and where they were specifically going to be involved. So, for example, we had Zoom moderators because Zoom was the platform that we were working on, and they would get a list of attendees that were going to be attending their events that day, and the section within that they were going to be allowing into it, so that we were sharing the load across our teams. And because of all of this, we needed so much more policy development. So we had things like our volunteer agreement. So that included our acceptable use policies, our social media policies, representing us as an organization. And as a World Health Association code compliant organization, we also had to make sure that everyone that was involved knew what the World Health Association code on the marketing of breast milk substitutes was. So that all was included in our training and in our development of the agreements for our volunteers. We also had to ensure that there was online safety. So we had new Zoom policies. And the key was making sure that it was safe and secure for everyone that was there, volunteers and our attendees, and making sure that everyone was protected. I mean, some of the subjects that we talk about at Breastfall can be quite sensitive, and we are dealing with children and young people in that as well. And at the time, everyone was very aware of the events that were being hacked, or Zoom bombed as it was being called at the time. And we needed to keep our volunteers up to date on how we were protecting them and our attendees, and any other events that were happening that were being hacked. We needed to ensure that we were stopping something like that happening to our attendees and our volunteers. And we're still learning. So things like, at the moment, if you're attending an event and you see somebody take a screenshot of the screen of all the participants that are there, we need to be ensuring that there's a disclaimer in attendees' tickets to say that they're agreeing to the use of their image and their name as it appears on screen, because that is a GDPR issue, and our volunteers need to be aware of that. So if they take a screenshot and they share it on social media, that they know that that's protecting them. So this all feeds into the positives that we found from digital volunteering. We found that the team development and planning training for our volunteers made that they were able to develop their digital skills. And we've heard that throughout the day, that there's been a lack of digital skills for some volunteers in learning how to use online platforms. So we found that all of our volunteers are now using the skills that they learned through our training and through the use of it during Breastfall in their daily lives and their professional lives. And it also, for us, was a massive positive when we moved online that we were able to increase our volunteer intake. So previously, when it was an event that was happening in Belfast, our volunteers needed to be available on that specific day and be able to get to Belfast. This year and last year, we were able to bring in volunteers from all over the UK and Ireland who were able to volunteer on the days that they were available and at the events that they were specifically passionate about as well. Some of the challenges that we did face when it was, how do we recognize our volunteers? Previously, we were able to give them our beautiful Breastfall t-shirts, poppets for their phones, all these physical things that we could hand over to them and have a celebration at the end of bringing people together. So we try to virtualize those sorts of experiences. So whereas they might have had a lanyard at an event before, we created Facebook frames that identified them as a volunteer of Breastfall. And our volunteers loved it because not only were they able to be seen as a trustworthy person to people who were attending, asking for support, but they were getting recognition from those around them of their giving up their time to volunteer for a really worthwhile experience. And also had people coming to them, asking them as experts in this space of, what is Breastfall? Tell me more. And they were engaging more of an audience for us as well. We then had our final night event, which meant that we were able to bring everybody together for a quiz and had a great night celebrating what was an incredible week. Some of the other challenges that we faced was recognizing that building connections with volunteers is much more difficult online. And that's something that we really focused on this year, creating personal interactions with our volunteers to ensure that it wasn't just somebody on the other side of a phone, but a real person. We had to manage the expectations in and for our volunteers. So whether that would be avoiding that volunteer burnout that we hear about, but also helping support our volunteers to recognize their abilities in taking on roles and responsibilities. In the year going forward, we are now looking at moving into a hybrid event, so being both online and in person. And what we need to recognize in that is that there's going to be a lot of input that we need to make. So we're going to need nearly twice the number of people volunteering because we need people on site at the event and people online. We also need to increase the resources that we use. So whether that be using an AV company and a new platform for what we're interacting with everybody and making sure that everybody's included, but then the training that goes behind that to ensure that our volunteers know how to use that. So this year we need to know earlier than ever what our event will look like next year so that we can serve our attendees and volunteers in the best way that we can. And this means promoting participation. So we're continuing to engage with our community. We're having this earlier involvement and sign up for volunteering and engaging with amazing organizations like Volunteering Now and all the people that we've met today. And hopefully we can continue that engagement going forward. So if anybody would like to get in touch with us, you can find us across all social media on Breastfall NI. You can get us on our website, breastfall.co.uk. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and hearing from the rest of the panel.
Catherine, that was absolutely terrific. Look at all those lovely applauses you're getting because it's maybe a new subject that you're bringing to us. The work of your volunteers is absolutely amazing. And as Denise Hayward mentioned in the general chat there, it is really important that to talk about and address the development of digital skills. So that's wonderful. And I can only think, if you haven't been awarded a Queen's Award for Voluntary Service, you should really think about getting the recognition for all the work that your volunteers do in that. It brings so much to women and families and the health of babies. It's just absolutely marvelous. So thank you for that. And I'll tell you what, we'll come back to questions when we've heard the other speakers. So hopefully that's fine. So if you have anything you want to ask of Catherine, just jot it down and we'll come back in a moment. So Kiva Watson is from ROC. She's next, and the subject is online volunteer recruitment and support. So Kiva, I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, it's great to join with you all today and to share our experience of online volunteer recruitment and support, particularly during the pandemic over the past nearly 2 years. So yes, I work for ROC, Redeeming Our Communities. We are a national charity right across the UK, and my role is the manager for Northern Ireland. And as part of that work, I am a volunteer manager as well as lots of different things too. So in ROC, our whole thing is about people of goodwill working together for safer, stronger communities. And the work that we do in our projects and action groups is all about partnership. And we see that as the best way of utilising resources and making a difference in transforming our communities. And so volunteering is a real key part of our work, and we couldn't do the work that we do without volunteers. They're very valuable and make a great contribution to our work. So we in Northern Ireland, over the past 2 years, have been adapting and being innovative into the way that we not only recruit volunteers, but do all of our programs and events, and like everyone, have went online for a lot of that. And last September, we were given the opportunity to do 2 new programs in response to COVID-19, and to support charities, to support families who were struggling and finding the time that we were in really difficult. So our Rock Community Mentoring Programme was set up in Ballysillan in North Belfast and in Larne. And we were already doing some work with local groups and churches and statutory agencies in both those communities. And these projects were about providing mentoring support for 10 weeks to families who were struggling maybe with homeschooling, isolation and loneliness. And we wanted to recruit volunteers who could journey alongside these parents and guardians and just be a listening ear and someone to listen to, and actually what I call a cheerleader, to be an advocate and a guide and to signpost families who were maybe were struggling to other organisations and groups in their local communities. So we needed a team of around 10 to 12 volunteers in both projects to enable us to do this work. And so online volunteer recruitment was key because everybody was stuck at home anyway. And so we already had a really good social media presence through Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And we felt that was a really great starting point for us to recruit volunteers, to actually even highlight the project and then kind of get people alongside. We would have done different campaigns showcasing the role of a mentor, what the role was about, how to become a mentor, and also the qualities needed. We didn't need people who were counsellors or qualified and all that. We needed ordinary people who could listen and just have the time to journey alongside these families. So using these promotional campaigns really helped us. And actually, we were able to target people because the opportunity was going to be doing this mentoring online on Zoom or by the phone, that it just wasn't in our local community. And one example is one girl who supported, was a follower on us on Twitter. She seen it one Saturday night and was inquired. And she lived in Portglenone and she wanted to volunteer in our North Belfast project because she felt she could offer her support and services, her skills. So doing that really did enable us to reach lots of volunteers in the local communities and beyond. But actually what really worked well for us was Volunteer Now's Be Collective site. And I'm not saying that because we're on a Volunteer Now conference, but actually it was so useful for us to widen our scope, our reach of getting volunteers, because we were able to share what it was, we were able to the documents, and it was such a really great way of connecting in with others who did not know anything about our charity, but actually had skills that would be good as a mentor. And from that, we got a number of volunteers who were successful and are being fantastic help. So I want to just say thank you, Volunteer Now, for that support and that tool that has been so useful to organisations like Rock and many others as well. Once we got our volunteers, during the restrictions, we couldn't meet online. We couldn't meet in person, so everything was online. We adapted our training and it was done over 2 evening sessions. And I think all of us have probably been a bit zoomed out, but it was such a great resource that actually it enabled others who maybe couldn't have taken a full Saturday away, to meet in person in a community hall, but actually being able to do it at home, people felt more comfortable and being able to do the training and were able to engage in it. And it worked very well because our volunteers were going to be doing the mentoring online, potentially over Zoom or WhatsApp or on the phone. It gave them good experience to play with Zoom and see how they could do it when we were doing little role plays. And so we really had to use these ways, and actually we built quite a good relationship together as a team over those training sessions. And again, our selection interviews and kind of getting to know the volunteers also took place online. And so during that time, we really did get to know our volunteers, and we felt that it was a great way of just connecting in with many others. And supporting volunteers then continued to be online, sadly, when we couldn't meet together. And we did that through monthly Zoom team meetings, and we tried to make them interactive with polls and videos and visiting speakers, generating peer support as well. All those important things that you would have done in person, just you had to bring your own refreshments and you were at the comfort of your own home. Most of all we wanted to do was just to appreciate and celebrate our volunteers for wherever they were and help them, and that they knew that even though we were all volunteering from home and we were maybe not seeing each other in person, that they were part of something bigger. And those monthly team meetings were really key about sharing stories, encouraging one another, and just sharing that experience and helping one another out. And we knew we'd built a really good relationship because in June, Rock Larne and the Telementor program there, volunteers got to meet together for the big lunch. We did an event in Larne in June, and actually you could see how people knew each other, and it was lovely to meet together. And one person says, "You're a lot taller than I thought you were." So it was a really great way of just that actually there was a good relationship and bond between the volunteers. So as we move to the future, so we've learned so much over the past 2 years, and we've had to adapt and learn a lot online and how to handle Zoom. And I have to say our experience has worked very well. And as a charity, we are now adapting our training program for the community mentoring program to be done online as well, because we have found that it has got enabled more people to volunteer, because people can do it from home. You know, you can log on to a Zoom meeting and have the kids in bed. You're not having to find a childminder, and it's enabling more opportunities for folks who maybe wouldn't have volunteered to do that. So it's really helped us to see it be more flexible and give those flexible opportunities. But yes, we do love in person still, and we try to do a mix of that now as well. And it is good to meet folks for a coffee, because I think some of us have felt a bit zoomed out, and we want to encourage those relationships. But what we have found has been really good, and I suppose because we've had to adapt, we've had to be innovative, but we've had to use lots of different ways in our volunteer recruitment. We will continue to use our social media platforms to recruit. We will continue to use Volunteer Now, Be Collective, because we find that a really good resource. But we'll also word of mouth. And as I said, that girl from Portland who volunteered with us, she encouraged a friend of hers in Ballymoney to volunteer as well. So it works in partnership, in tandem with, you know, those traditional ways of recruiting volunteers, word of mouth and encouraging others, announcements. It definitely isn't on its own, but it is actually a very important thing, and we need to think more and be more strategic in our recruitment programs and promotional campaigns to encourage more people to hear about the work that's happening and be flexible in the ways of their volunteering opportunities. So yeah, that's just some of our experiences. We're still learning like everybody, but we have found it to be a really interesting time, but we know that's been preparing us, like the theme of today, for the work that's going to continue on in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you.
Thank you, Kiva. A lot of response on the general chat, for sure. Responses from Be Collective having been mentioned a few times there, and for other people to be, you know, connecting to them. And also the idea that, you know, building a team online is helping people to feel part of something bigger. But that's from Denise. You've had a really positive experience, Kiva, and it's great despite all the challenges, and it's great to hear that. And you made us smile a couple of times and thinking, oh, you're taller than I thought you were going to be, or whatever. Those are really lovely. So people are saying, well done, Kiva, that is absolutely super. And we'll come back for more questions because there are a few coming in. So thank you. So we'll move on next from Kiva. And next up, somebody you may be very familiar with. I remember him from the volunteer conference back in December 2016. He has an international reputation. He is Rob Jackson, and he will contribute his thoughts on, and again, this is very much the theme of what we're talking about today, is innovation and flexibility. So I'll hand over to you, Rob. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Double whammy of having to say something new and inventive after what has been a fantastic day of speakers, but then also talk about innovation and flexibility when almost everybody has mentioned innovation and flexibility in their remarks so far. So I hope what I talk about over the course of the next few minutes will reinforce some of what we've all been learning today and potentially give you some new thoughts as well. So I'm going to tackle both of those themes separately, but with the kind of flexibility is a bit of a bridge into the innovation, really. And in terms of flexibility, what I want to talk about is 3 drivers for change. Drivers for change in flexibility before COVID-19, pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, and then what we may well see as we enter the kind of post-pandemic phase, hopefully as 2021 rolls into 2022 and beyond. So, like many things, the changes that we've seen brought along in volunteering by the pandemic haven't necessarily been new changes. What they've done is accelerate things that we already knew that we were going to have to adapt to. And pre-pandemic, flexibility was absolutely a part of that. It's a theme and a topic I've been speaking on for at least the last 10 years. And it can be best summed up really by the fact that our competition for volunteers is not with each other as volunteer involving organisations, but with anything that people in the general public can spend their spare time doing. So our competition for volunteers, as you may have heard me say before, is people, you know, going to pre-pandemic, going to sports events, going to the theatre, going to the cinema, going to concerts, seeing family, seeing friends, travelling, all of those kinds of things. We have in that context to allow and enable their volunteering to fit with their lives, not just with our needs. Our volunteering has to fit with their lives, not their volunteering has to only fit with our needs. It's about getting that balance, because quite simply, if we didn't, then people wouldn't volunteer. And during the pandemic, as we've seen during the course of the sessions earlier on, particularly before lunch, there was lots of early volunteering, or should we say lots of early interest in volunteering, because people suddenly found themselves at home with nothing to do but sit and watch Netflix in their pajamas all day. Furlough kicked in, there was lots of spare time, people were suddenly interested in helping in volunteering. But what was important in that volunteering that they did, those that went on to actually give time, was that people took the control of their own volunteering. They helped when they wanted and on their own terms, often via the very social media and technology platforms that many of us pre-pandemic were resistant to embracing. So people were volunteering by simply putting their hands up and saying, yes, I'll help on a WhatsApp group or a Nextdoor group or Facebook, etc. But they had control of their own volunteering in something and structured as the NHS volunteer responders here in England. You chose when you went online to be able to access opportunities. You weren't called upon at any hour of the night or day. You were in control of that. And as we saw crucially during the pandemic, volunteering tailed off in later lockdowns. One of the things that I remember reading this time last year was a report from Pro Bono Economics that found that there were 6 million fewer people volunteering in the second lockdown, which in England was finishing around about now, than in the first lockdown. And to put that into context, 6 million fewer people volunteering is about half the total number of people that we think volunteered during the pandemic or during that first year in England. And they weren't volunteering in the second lockdown because of the things that have been mentioned today. Working from home was more the norm. Homeschooling was more the norm. They just couldn't fit volunteering around their commitments, even though they were spending most of their time at home, not going into offices. So flexibility was important to us a year ago, not just now and not just into the future. But when we look to the future, I think it's probably fair to say people's expectations of volunteering have changed because of their experiences during the last 2 years. I just mentioned people helping on their own terms when they wanted to, not necessarily when we needed them. Older volunteers who've enjoyed a break from volunteering and won't necessarily automatically rush back. That's what Scott was talking about this morning, that they're seeing this slow, very slow return to volunteering, if indeed it's happening at all, amongst those over the age of 65. And we're seeing that across the UK, either because people are nervous about coming back because COVID-19 is still very much a reality, either because they enjoyed a break from volunteering, or frankly, they're not thrilled at being used, and I use that word advisedly, they're not thrilled at being used by organisations like many organisations did before the pandemic. And as Tiger's just said, people want normality back. People, we don't call it the new normal anymore, we call it building back better, or whatever the phrase of the day is. When the pandemic does eventually come to an end and we do eventually learn to live with COVID-19, volunteering will still have to compete with everything else that people want to do in their lives. The difference will be that many of those things that people wanted to do for their lives have been put on hold for 2 years: traveling, visiting family, having a social life, sport, theatre, gigs. Return to normality does not necessarily equate to a return to volunteering. So we're going to have to change, and we're going to have to adapt, and we're going to have to be more flexible, not just because of the change that the pandemic's brought and will bring, but because of the changes we were seeing before the pandemic as well. Which leads on into innovation. What do we need to do to change? And I want to pick up on 3 areas in particular: volunteer journey planning, collaboration, sharing and passporting, and online versus in real life, or the latest 3-letter abbreviation that has come to become a part of our lives now, IRL, in real life. So volunteer journey planning, this all links back into the theme of flexibility and to other things people have been saying today. We need to provide a range of ways people can get involved with a variety of commitments to suit. Everything from light touch, bite-sized, to long-term, regular, committed volunteering, and everything in between. It may be, as one of the comments in the chat said, that light touch, bite-sized works for the volunteer, but might not, as we currently conceive volunteering, work for us. Well, frankly, we've got to try and find a way to make it work for us, because people are not going to sign up for the long-term regular commitment on day one. But I will come on to that again in a second around collaboration and sharing. We have to find ways to give volunteers control over how they fit volunteering into their lives. There may well be a role for technology in our organizations, but we have to let go. We have to empower people, and we have to trust people. Scott spoke this morning about breaking out of those historical constructs of volunteering, not just about letting go and empowering and trusting people, but also as a way to embrace a greater diversity in our volunteer teams as well. We have to look at how we integrate volunteering into the wider supporter journeys that our organizations may have, maybe more relevant to some of the larger organizations amongst you, but how can people move seamlessly between volunteering, donating, campaigning, taking a break from volunteering, donating, campaigning, and other ways of supporting our organizations? Because the reality is retention has changed. We keep people by letting them go now. If we try and hang on to people for dear lives, they won't respond positively to that. And I keep coming back, and some of you may have heard me say this at events before, I keep coming back to that quote from Carl Wilding, the former chief exec of NCVO, a couple of years ago, that we have to realize they're not our volunteers. We are their organization. We have to listen to how they want to engage with us and provide ways for them to do that. And if we don't, we're not only not going to keep them, we're not going to attract them in the first place. Moving on into collaboration, sharing and passporting. The good news, if all of that sounds challenging, is you can't and don't have to do it all on your own. If you're not competing with other volunteer involving organizations in your community, then how can you collaborate together to share that load between you? It may be that you can't offer light touch volunteering. You know, we're not saying every organization is suitable for offering size volunteering. You can't do that as a Samaritan organization. You can't do that as a lifeboat crew. You can't do that as mountain rescue necessarily. but other organisations may be able to offer light touch and you vice versa. Can you build into your volunteer journey the idea of people moving between organisations and sharing volunteers between organisations when they're ready to make those changes? And how can we make that easier for volunteers? So we spoke earlier on about the idea of passporting schemes. Happy to come back to it in the questions. I'm slightly sceptical about large-scale passporting schemes, but local passporting schemes could be a real key to helping make that happen. And again, local volunteering infrastructure can play a key role in that. And then finally, online versus in real life. We all know that technological adoption has been a huge driver for change in the pandemic. It was only 2 years ago that many of us were together in Belfast for the last in-person conference that Volunteer Now did, and hopefully that will be coming again in future. But we're all going to have to face questions in our organisations, in our sector, in our society, what in real life brings that online doesn't, and vice versa. What do we want to keep from this shift to online? It has revived some volunteer groups and committees because it's more flexible, as we've been hearing. People can fit it more easily around their lives. What do we want to ditch by way of technology and bring in real life in? I was working with a group in south of the border in the Republic of Ireland last week, the week before, that was saying they find it a lot harder to recruit now, because it used to be that they would simply tap somebody on the shoulder at an event and get them to volunteer that way. And they can't do that. You can't tap somebody on a shoulder on Zoom. So how do we make that happen? Equally, the time well spent research that for some unfathomable reason didn't include Northern Ireland, but did include England, Wales and Scotland nearly 3 years ago now, found that 18 to 34-year-olds were the age group most likely to say that volunteering was important to them as a way of combating social isolation. And yet these are the very people that most of us think are going to want to embrace and love online volunteering. And yet the research is suggesting that they're the very people who actually are craving potentially for in-person volunteering. So we have to think creatively and carefully about what we keep online, what we return to in real life when it's safe to do so, and how we mix the two in hybrid. Always bearing in mind, of course, that we need to consider the digital exclusion issues that come with that. I love the phrase from earlier about not spots as well as hot spots with IT access. And innovation in online, in real life and hybrid ways of working, therefore, are going to be key. Challenging assumptions and questioning some of the norms that have become norms in the last 2 years and norms that were there well before 2 years ago. So to sum up, we've got to embrace more flexibility in volunteering, or quite frankly, we're going to face irrelevance when it comes to attracting volunteers. We've got to innovate. And when we think of innovation, we generally think that means big change, but it might be lots of small incremental change. And doing what we've always done will no longer get what we always got anymore. But I don't know about you, but I find the opportunities ahead quite exciting and exhilarating. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the panel. Look forward to hearing what our final panelists got to say and any questions that you want to ask afterwards. Back to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Rob. A lot of thoughts coming in as you were talking. You sort of you sparked off ideas in people, and we'll come back to those later on. And we'll move now to the final contribution from Peter Mcmahon. So Peter is our final speaker on this panel, and it's on the subject of, he's head of services, sorry, lost my track there a bit, head of services and support at Housing Rights. So good afternoon to you, Peter. And hopefully we'll have Peter with us shortly. And just while we're waiting for that, if you go and have a look into the general chat, you'll see how many interesting ideas are coming up. There's a few there from Raquel about the Volunteer Now event ambassadors team, which is a really interesting concept about kind of like self-service. You offer yourself a shift and things like that. It looks really interesting. But Peter's with us online now in full view. So I will hand over to your good self, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, everybody. I think Bev is going to upload my presentation, the slides. Hopefully you'll be able to see those. I'm delighted to be able to come along. I'm delighted to be able to come along and speak at the conference today. I'm going to take the next 10 minutes just to tell you a little bit about Housing Rights, our work around volunteers, actually peers and volunteers, and our experience around that with diversity and inclusion. Housing Rights is a charity. It's at 58 years old. It was formed in 1964. I came along a year or two just after that. We currently have 52 members of staff, and interestingly, certainly pre-COVID, we had 13 active volunteers, 10 peers, and we have a board who are volunteers also of 12 people. So our peers and volunteers and our board would make up well in excess of 50% of our paid staff. Of course, a lot of speakers have alluded to the impact of COVID, and for us, it hasn't been any different. Since March 20, the opportunities we've had in terms, it's kind of slowed down our development program for peers and volunteers across the organisation. Hopefully, not be too much longer before we can get that back to full swing, although we have been making some inroads during the pandemic. So back in 2019, we decided as an organisation, as we had been developing programs around peers and volunteers and investing in that area a lot more, we applied through the International Standards Suite of Accreditation for the BS standards for diversity and inclusion, BS 76005. You can see there on the screen, and we got that, and we did that with the permission of a lot of the people we were working with in our volunteer and peer program. And I'll show you, hopefully at the end, a little photograph of us up at Stormont getting presented with that. So it was very much with the people we were working with, rather, and their permission and desire for us to do this, rather than an organisational need to get this award. And on the back of that, then we followed through last year during COVID with the Investing in Volunteers UK Quality Standard. If I can go to the next slide then, Bev. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our services and projects for a few minutes. And where I wanted to start, I thought was very relevant. Almost just over a decade ago, we were based in the prisons. We had housing advisors based in each of the 3 custody centres in Northern Ireland, in Mcmahon, outside Lisburn, and McGilligan out up in the Causeway Coast, up by Limavady, and Highbank Wood, which was known as the Young Offenders Detention Centre. It's a college now, Highbank Wood College, and the women's prison is located in there too. So we had advisors in each of those 3 prisons for the first time, giving advice to people in custody who would potentially be getting released homeless to try to prevent that. We then, the demand was so high, we came up with the idea, and we visited other jurisdictions in England, St Giles Trust and Shelter, to learn from them as to how they had developed peer services with prisoners. And we introduced that in Northern Ireland. And what we did was we began to recruit and train longer term prisoners within those 3 settings to become peers. And what we did was we equipped them with the knowledge, the training, they gained accreditation, so that they could in turn advise people coming into custody on committal. They could do presentations to everybody coming in on committal. They could tell them what they needed to do to secure their tenancy, or what would happen if they were going to be homeless on release. And just before COVID, before the prisons closed down, the external agencies being allowed to come in, we had 10 peers across the 3 prisons. They all had gained accreditation in the Housing Advice Training Programme, a recognised housing advice qualification that would enable them post-release potentially to get employment and enhance their employment opportunities. It allowed us to expand the reach of our service. The prisoners speaking to other prisoners and giving advice to other prisoners was something that was recognised when we took user feedback from prisoners who actually said to us, realising we were talking to one of our own, as it was put, it made us more open to talk about our housing problems, rather than the statutory agencies and people who they wouldn't traditionally have spoke to. And they saw us as an independent organisation facilitating that. So as a result of that, we were actually able to reach 2,000 more prisoners every year through the peer programme. Once a housing inquiry became too complex, it was referred up to the housing advisor, and then the housing advisor that went each week was able to pick up the more complex work. So the system worked quite well, and it certainly helped us in terms of our reach and the breadth and depth of the project. It brought extra value, really. I'll talk a little bit about employment opportunities later, because a couple of our peer prisoners on release actually came and got employment with us, and further qualifications through other opportunities that we were able to provide. We also had more recently developed a housing rights BME or BAME project, as it would be known now, where we again worked with people in BAME communities and the surrounding areas and where we're based, and trained peer advocates to become housing champions. We provided training, mentoring, support, resources, training the BAME peer advocates, the housing champions, in housing advice and knowledge, and getting them their accreditation. They were able to take that into their own communities, much the same as the prisoners, and give advice to the people in their own communities, because we would be unfamiliar ourselves and wouldn't expect to know everything, particularly around cultural norms in those communities, whereas the housing champions were able to bring that right into their neighbours and friends and colleagues in the communities, and it gave them access to dedicated housing advisors. So again, it brought additional value for us. In fact, the housing champions through the BAME Peer Advocate Programme were able to help us redesign parts of our website and write for us frequently asked questions relevant to their communities, and translate those for us. So we were able to put those into different languages and put them up onto our public information website, and they still sit there today. Just after that, Brexit came along, and the department approached us around what we could do. That dreaded word, Brexit. Maybe it's not so dreaded for some, but there was an opportunity here to give information when people were concerned about eligibility and all the things to do with housing and Brexit, to translate information on our website that was Brexit relevant for people in different languages. And we were able to go back and avail of our peer advocates and the housing champions and give them employment opportunities as translators to come and write information for us on the site, which the department sponsored for us. So that was an example of how that relationship being built could continue and work on beyond just the BME project. And then just more recently again, we've been piloting a young persons project where we're looking to work with young people to prevent homelessness, and we've introduced a mediation service to that. It's currently part funded by some charitable funds that we've secured and some housing executive funding. We're waiting on the final stage and the final outcome of a larger application to another charitable grant-making trust for the remainder of the next 3 years funding, where we hope to expand it into a full service. And this time what we're going to do is introduce the idea of a young person's advocate, somebody with previous lived homelessness experience, to bring added value to the service and help us inform how it should grow and develop. So we're really excited about that, and we've just literally begun that journey in September this year. As an organisation, our next strategic plan will run from 2023, probably for 5 more years beyond that. And we're looking at new opportunities to develop services and be more diverse and inclusive, and look for more opportunities for peers and volunteers. So one of the areas we're looking at is travellers for that. That's just one example of where we might go next. And if I could have the final slide, Bev. Just a little insight into, I've been speaking a lot about our peers and volunteers within those services. In terms of our volunteers and our people, our most precious commodity, our most precious resort, I think for me, I'm genuinely grateful for all of the fantastic work that's carried out by our peers and our volunteers. They donate their time, their skills, their energy, their experience, and they truly make a difference and have a positive impact on the lives of other people every day by helping us in our mission and delivering on our mission. In terms of volunteering as an organisation, we've invested in a staff and volunteer development coordinator who is in post and has helped us bring those through those accreditation awards that are referred to. And we continually look for volunteer opportunities. We have about 15 to 20 volunteer roles in the organisation, right across from admin to comms to policy to advice. We're always looking to invest and have a dedicated budget every year for learning and development for our peers and volunteers. And right at the very start, I'll come on to the final 2 pictures just now, but I mentioned about pathways to employment. Some of our peers in the prisons and some of our BAME peers have all come and worked for us in full employment in the organisation. And that's a fantastic journey, that trajectory of coming through volunteering through to internship maybe. One of our interns actually was put through their professional law exams. We were able to give them a master and get them through their institute exams, and they went on to become a housing advisor and a part-time solicitor with us. So there's great opportunities can come. I think I always say the organisation as a whole has to be very grateful for the sum of all of the parts, as Aristotle would have put it. So we're very committed as an organisation, and for us it's always right it's always about identifying and involving the right people at the right times to get the right interventions and for us the right results and creating those opportunities. So I just finished by showing you two photographs, Bev. If you put the first divider of them up, that's our award up in 2019 at Stormont. Some of our board are there, some of our people from the BME community. That was our Diversity and Inclusion Award. We were told we were the first organisation in Europe, not just in Northern Ireland or UK or Ireland, but in Europe to get a joint award for learning and development and diversity and inclusion. I'm only speaking about the diversity and inclusion today, but it was also for learning and development, and that's a little snapshot. I'm a little bit younger in that. And the final picture is just a day out with our peers and volunteers up at Stormont on a different day. So I thought that would be just a nice way to leave it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. That was an absolute revelation. I had no idea, and I hope I'm not alone in this, in learning about all that you do for individuals and how important the work you do is, contribution of volunteers, the creating opportunities for them after, you know, the worst of times that they might have been through. So that was hugely inspiring. So thank you very much for that. Now, what we can do is, I wonder, and Bev will be listening in the background, do you want to bring each of the speakers up onto the screen for everyone to see? Perhaps that might be a way of doing it. So here's Rob coming up, and it would be lovely if we could have Kiva and Catherine as well. There we go. Here's Catherine coming up. That is lovely. And there's a lot of questions have come in. So they get ranked in, like, there's 3 people would like to know a little bit more about this. It might pick up for you, Peter, but it's the same for anybody. So if you'd like to make a comment, when we're recording radio programs on Zoom, we put our hand up like that, which looks a bit ignorant, but the principle is we know who wants to speak, and we can get it all sorted. So here's the first question. What advice would you have for organizations? And this has come up consistently, certainly through this afternoon, seeking to broaden the diversity of their volunteering pool. So a few people have been asking that question. Who would like to take it on? Rob.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. I want to just go back to what Scott was talking about earlier on this morning, about the idea of volunteering being a kind of very Western developed construct, and there being many communities around the world. He was giving examples, for example, for the Maori community in New Zealand, where he's from, who don't have that same concept. In fact, perhaps don't even have that same word for volunteering, because it's just integral to what they do. And for me, for a long time, my thought on this has been, the more we talk about groups being underrepresented in volunteering, the more we're putting the problem on them, not on us. And they're underrepresented because they're not doing what we, the mainstream, count as volunteering. So what is incumbent upon us is then to broaden our concept of volunteering to embrace a wider understanding of volunteering and therefore become more attractive to other groups. So it's about us needing to take that step, knowing where they're coming from, knowing their history, their culture around volunteering, but also being willing to shift volunteering away from that very well-off doing to the less well-off, bureaucratic, overly complex Western structures to something that's a bit more open and flexible and adaptable.
Yeah, really good thoughts. Does anybody just like to add to that? As you say, it's really been a theme for the whole of the day. There was a lot from Scott right to the moment about including people with disabilities within volunteering, or as you are doing, Peter, in including people who come from possibly the untraditional background of volunteering and doing the most amazing amount of good. Catherine, Kiva, any thoughts on that? Broadening diversity, gender, background and so forth. It's been really interesting hearing that discussed, isn't it? So shall I move on to the next question? Here we go. Did you find that online recruitment means that you get lots of light touch inquiries which don't always result in people actually getting involved? So shall I come to you first, Catherine? Would that be all right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine.
Just your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I suppose as we saw from the presentations earlier in the day, and as Rob said earlier about the fact that we've seen that high influx in interest in volunteering rather than taking the action, I think we're going to find that across any event or any volunteering opportunity. So you have, when you're organising an event, you always expect online to have around 50% of a uptake of people that are going to turn up. So those are the things that we take into account when in relation to volunteering for us as well. I suppose in those situations are the people that are already vocally passionate about being involved in something. So whether they're recognizing that they're already involved in some other volunteering organization, or that they have a connection in particular to the event, is something that we really try to latch onto and encourage and support in that. Particularly around digital, people beforehand wouldn't have got in touch with us unless that they were specifically going to be there for the day. Whereas now it's like, oh, I might be there and I might be available. So I think light touch is absolutely something that comes up in relation to the start of digital volunteering, but it's engaging with those people and then following up as well is a massive thing for us to make sure that we create those funnels of bringing people in and getting them to the right place.
And both yourself and Kiva were involved in online volunteering, you know, and getting people to be volunteering online. Is there anything you'd like, you know, to share with us? You know, what learning can we take from your experience of getting people, you know, recruiting people online? Any thoughts, Kiva, possibly?
Again, like I had shared, you know, yes, there is some light touches, you know, people are inquiring, but you do have to follow that up with phone call, get to know. For our experience, it was a unique volunteering role. So we wanted to ensure we had the right people who were going to be mentors, because they're journeying alongside with families. So you want to make sure you have people who are committed. So we aim to have 10 to 12 volunteers, but actually we probably at a whole need to recruit 20 because it all funneled down during the selection and recruitment process. It takes time, you know, doing all those different promotional campaigns. You want to make it sound different. You're trying to, how do I promote mentoring in a different way? And it's really just trying to be interactive and following up with all those little inquiries, maybe messages to your Facebook page. Try not to miss those, but really contacting them. And that is actually really good doing that over the phone, you know, so you get to chat through with it and answer any questions as well. And I think that's when the personal touch really works well with online, and online can't be on its own. It has to be integrated into the whole volunteer recruitment
that brings in that question there, doesn't it? Do you think that volunteer management is different for online roles? Any thoughts, anyone?
Well, I would say volunteer management, no matter what, it's about the people. So it's about, but it's about the interaction pathway as well as the support process that has changed. So online, it's becoming even more about the people now. So we need to be aware of the environment that we're working on, and then how that impacts the people that we're working with. So it may be that they don't have those digital skills, but they want to be involved. So how do we support them down that pathway? Or it might be that previously they haven't been involved in volunteering because they've got social anxiety, but now being online gives them that opportunity to be involved. So as a whole, volunteer management hasn't changed because it's about people, but it's about being aware of the environment around that and how we focus that onto the people themselves.
Yes, okay. A good general principle, really, that. Peter, I think this is probably coming towards you, but Rob, you may be familiar with it too. A few people are asking, how do you think the criminal record check systems can work with passporting schemes?
Yes, well, in terms of the criminal, I'm not sure how that question's coming. It may be because I did allude to our peer prisoners who have since, some of those have since come and gained employment with us. I mean, we didn't treat them any differently in that we went through our Access NI checks, although as organisations we have a responsibility to risk assess. So whenever we got the criminal records from the Access NI body to Housing Rights, we were able to look at those and meet with the person released from custody, the prisoner who we've been working with. You know, so we realised that the other thing is we would never have been dealing with people through the public protection arrangements. There's already a separate process for accommodation needs of prisoners who have public protection offences, and probation would have to deal with those where there are restrictions on where they can live and where they can be housed. Scheduled offenders and high risk offenders. So it wouldn't be those kind of offenders we would be dealing with. So whilst there were a lot of charges on the Access NI records, that didn't stop us employing them. As long as we knew the risk that we had to deal with, we were able to put in place boundaries for that person, for example, on our case recording systems and access to protect them really from that. So we were able to create the opportunity. It wasn't a barrier, it was something we had to work around, and that's just something we had to be conscious of.
Rob, there's a question there. Someone's asking, what do you think are the important ingredients for high quality volunteer training online? Have you done much of that as yet? I mean, obviously everybody's been online a lot.
Not specifically. I haven't done specifically stuff. I think any kind of high quality training really is about being learner centered. So it's about understanding not only what they want to know, but being providing the content in a way that is creative and participative for people. So it's using the kind of standard mix of things, which thankfully platforms like the one we're using today and platforms like Zoom and Teams latterly have enabled us to do by having breakout rooms, and basically the same kind of thing that we would do in person, but in a kind of smaller way, because obviously everybody's smaller on a box, hence that point of I didn't realize how tall you were, which I've had that since meeting somebody in person for the first time after 2 years of doing it online. So I think it's just about understanding where they're coming from and couching it in language that works for them. I would also say, if I may, just on the criminal record checks and passporting, that's where I was kind of coming from when I said earlier on about I question the validity and the practicality is probably a better word of the national passporting schemes, because one organisation can do their ANI check and their references and have their volunteers approved, but if those volunteers then are supposed to be moving to another organisation and taking that ANI and references with them, the reality is that the second organisation is always going to want to run their own checks anyway. Because God forbid anything goes wrong, are you going to be comfortable when it goes to the tabloid press that you didn't do those checks, somebody else did? So I'm always skeptical. I think risk and liability just plays too big a part when it comes to those really formal bits of passporting. I think the practical passporting is the much smaller scale, the much local. That's where the effort and energy can really have a bit of a payoff.
And Catherine, do you have any tips on, obviously you have really created something, you and your volunteers have created, something very new online. Have you any tips as to, what techniques you used in recruiting or working with volunteers that really made this such a success?
I suppose for us, it comes back to being people-centered. It's about giving them ownership over this as much as we have ownership over it. And the fact that our volunteers grow from people who have participated throughout our organisation. So it really is their event as much as it is ours. I suppose a lot of it comes down to the idea that this is facilitation of events and facilitation of training rather than teaching anybody anything, because we need to come from where they are right now and bring in their skills and develop it from there. We also are very, very aware that things are going to change year by year. So looking at the fact that in 2020, everybody wanted to be involved because they had time and they had space to do it. This year it was more difficult because they could go out and they could be places, or they just needed to have more space, or they were zoomed out completely, didn't want to be in front of a screen. So engaging people in a way that they can be vocal in their own place has been massive for us, and asking them what they want. I mean, people always want to tell you what they want and what they need, and giving them space to do that is huge for us. So I think, ownership and shared responsibility is where we come from.
Yeah, and without a doubt, involving people online, you're developing skills within them that they may use in other places. You know, it's all a very positive experience, and it's lovely to hear such very, very different stories, but you can see the interconnections between them all. So I think that's great. I think we've got through all the questions there that were on the panel. I was so nervous at the beginning of this this encounter through digital technology, but I've absolutely loved it. I really have. I think it's absolutely amazing the things that we can do. And yes, we look forward to, you know, interacting with each other face to face, but this digital interaction with people near and far, far away has been a really positive experience for this year's conference. So a big thank you to our panel, Peter Mcmahon, Rob Jackson, Catherine Muldoon, and Kiva Watson. That's absolutely super. And I think what I'll do now is hand over to the CEO of Volunteer Now, Denise Hayward, who's been with us all day listening in. And so if it's all right with you, Denise, I shall log out and you can take star position on the screen. Personally, it's been a wonderful experience. I've heard so much, learned so much. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity of bringing me on board for this. And I wish you and the organisation all the very best. Thanks so much, Denise.
Thanks so much, Helen. Well, everybody else, well done for sticking through the whole day of our fantastic conference. So it was for me, just a couple of takeaways, 3 words: positive, flexible, and inclusive. Was what I've got really at the forefront of my mind, and it's really been inspiring to hear brilliant speakers from all over the world today. So I suppose I wanted just to say thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you so much to the speakers. I think we'll all agree the richness of what we've heard today, the sharing of experience has been absolutely fantastic. And we've been really, I think, really enhanced by what we've heard today. And I think there's so much to take away and think about. And I'm really positive about that. I want to just say a big thank you to the Volunteer Now staff team behind the scenes, all the work that goes into putting this event together. I've really appreciated all your support on that. Thank you to Bev and the team from DigiLeaders, who've been great throughout the day and have saved us from technological catastrophe, which is brilliant. And definitely a huge thank you to Helen, who's been a lovely compere and drawn the event together. So it wouldn't be a Volunteer Now event if you didn't have a network, an evaluation forum winging its way to you. So look out for that. It'll be coming to you by email in the next few days. Love to hear your feedback, and also thinking about planning our calendar of activities and events for next year. So please drop in ideas and thoughts, because we want to put together a plan that suits you all. And then finally, our networking slot will stay open for another little while, probably about another half hour. So please don't rush off. Stay and have a chat with people maybe you haven't seen for a wee while. So thank you all for a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.